Hi and welcome. I'm Leah Tarachansky and I'm live right now with Dimitri Lascaris. Just a couple of words about who I am. I'm an Israeli-Canadian, Soviet-born journalist and filmmaker, and I make documentaries. And I met Dimitri quite a while ago. We were both on a panel hosted at what was then Beit Zatoun, which was run by Robert Massoud, about the situation in Israel-Palestine, as well as the Green Party and its remarkable stance on the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. So it's really exciting to be here now live with you, Dimitri. Why don't you talk a little bit about what we're doing here today?
Thank you very much, Leah. We actually met a little bit before that gathering. We met at the Green Party of Canada's biannual meeting in Ottawa in August of 2016. That's when I first got to know you, and I had already been by that point in time a great admirer of your work as a documentary filmmaker and a journalist. And
why, thank you.
I want to very much thank you for for hosting this today and being just a friend and guiding me in so many ways over the past few years in the work of my activism. Thank you. I started thinking about running for just leading up into the question of how we ended up on this program today, started thinking about running for the leadership back in November of last year. And I took quite a while to make up my mind, admittedly more than I would have liked. And the question I was grappling with is what really is the best way that I can contribute. For the last few years, I've been doing a lot of pro bono legal work after retiring from my class actions practice in 2015. I'm doing a lot of activism, doing independent journalism for a great organization called the Real News Network. And I had to weigh up whether, running for the leadership of this party, which is so dear to me, was a better way to contribute. And I ultimately decided that it is. But I took so much time to make up my mind that by the time I got around to launching my campaign, we were just a few days away from the coronavirus crisis really hitting Canada hard. That was at the beginning of March. And almost within, I'd say 3 days, I and other leadership candidates whom I'm honored to be running against, we had to suspend all in-person campaigning. And then what became clear within a few more days of that is that the economic crisis emanating from this terrible virus we're all confronting didn't really make it appropriate for us to be fundraising. And so, in fact, a few days ago, together with 4 other leadership candidates, we came together and announced a suspension jointly of fundraising activities. And we've called upon the party to think about whether perhaps it's appropriate to relax the fundraising rules in these extraordinary circumstances we confront. But that means that 2 things, all of that. One is that we've had to really just run our campaign electronically and virtually. This is part of that initiative. And secondly, we all have to operate on a very tight budget. So we came up with this idea, in part with your excellent input, about having a weekly program. And we don't want this to be a 2-way conversation. We want to have a lot of voices in this program. So every week we're going to have a different guest. In a moment, you're going to introduce our guest for today, who's a wonderful a leader from the Indigenous community. We're going to also hear from our audience. And maybe people just want to comment. Maybe people want to ask questions of me or my guest. And either way, I think it's really important for us to have these conversations in this extraordinary time.
Yeah, so this is actually so interesting, like you launch your political campaign, this really exciting moment in your life. You've been building up for this for years. The press has been speculating, are you going to run? You're not going to run. And then 3 days later, your life gets derailed the way all of our lives got derailed. So I felt that this particular moment was a great learning tool, not just about how we're going to collectively get through this, but I think that this moment has also shown us, without a question, that we are living in a society where we all need each other, even in this extreme capitalistic society we're living in. This crisis has shown more than anything that what we think is impossible is possible, that we can have different lifestyles, and also that there are a number of things that we can learn. And I think that was, this kind of uncertainty of what is coming in the future. How is this going to impact me? How is it going to impact you? How is it going to impact our economy. All these questions were building up, and I feel that by being glued to the 24-hour news cycle and panic scrolling through social media was not answering a lot of those questions. So we thought,
this confinement has, exacerbated that tendency we have in the world today. And I just say, for me, sorry to interrupt you, but for me personally, one of the great lessons I've had, even though I'm privileged to be able to stay in my home, nobody in my family has been stricken by this virus, thankfully. And I have my wife, my daughter here with me. I didn't really appreciate how much I have come to value my personal interactions with people, just the day-to-day interactions that we take for granted. And I feel like there's really big void in my life now because I have so much less contact with other people. And I'm not nearly as much of a solitary human being as I used to think of myself. It's been a kind of enlightening experience for me personally. I'm a much more social being than I think I realized I was before. And I'm craving the moment when we can go back to having that way of life and just interacting with people without looking at them as though there's some kind of threat to us, some kind of involuntary threat. I know we'll get there, but it's going to take some ingenuity and creativity for us to get through this moment, this difficult period, and really maintain our humanity.
100%. And I think that, the first question that we wanted to tackle, as settlers on this land here in Turtle Island, Canada, as you mentioned, we are very, very privileged in terms of our experience of this. And I'm just speaking for myself. But there's so many things that this crisis has illuminated. In my home country, in Israel, this corona crisis has created the opportunity for basically a political coup. I was born in the Soviet Union and Russia. This has been a really terrifying time with incredible police crackdown. And here in Canada with neocolonialism and the processes of land grabs and everything that is going on in the so-called Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we were very curious about how this crisis is impacting Indigenous communities. We're here in Toronto, and not far from us is the largest reserve in Canada, 6 Nations. And so we were very lucky that Diane Longboat had agreed to join us. She'll be coming in on air in just a minute, and I'd like to introduce her more fully. So Kahundakwas, Diane Longboat, is from the Mohawk Nation. She's from the Turtle Clan, and she's a traditional teacher from the 6 Nations Grant River Territory, Canada. As a ceremonial leader, educator, teacher of Indigenous spiritual ways, and healer, she's also a spiritual activist. So welcome, Diane. It's such a great pleasure to have you. Hi, Diane. Are you? Can you hear us?
I can, but it's a little bit choppy.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Welcome. It's such a pleasure to have you with us on the show today. We just wanted to start with, if you don't mind, saying a few words about where you are right now and how this is impacting you right now.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to join you today. I'm really delighted. I am at 6 Nations Grand River Territory, which is between Hamilton and Brantford, Ontario. The community is blocked off from visitors coming and going, and only residents allowed in. We have a center that is set up in our community center for testing. And so there's a call-in number that you would phone, and if you need to be tested, you can go there for testing. So I think the community is extremely, I would say, ready for this, in the sense of helping each other, taking care of the elders, making sure everybody has what they need, and so on. So it's an opportunity for families to be together. If we can find something positive out of this, it's the engendering of community spirit.
Diane, Dimitri here. I want to just reiterate Leah's thanks for you coming on the program. I met you about, I think it was back in 2016 when I came to the Teaching and Healing Lodge that you run near 6 Nations. And
Mhm.
that for me, Diane, was a very moving experience. I'm glad we have the opportunity to talk again. It's been too long. And one thing I think people would be very interested to hear is, on a practical level, how has this crisis impacted Six Nations? What steps have been taken to protect people? I mean, the Indigenous peoples have been historically underserved, underprotected by both federal and provincial governments. And I can imagine in this circumstance, Indigenous peoples, including Six Nations, have had to take steps to protect themselves. Could you talk to us a little bit about what that's been like and what challenges your community is confronting on a day-to-day basis in the face of this crisis?
Well, as much as I can tell you is, my drives around the community, and seeing long lineups of cars of non-Indigenous people congesting our small highways, which are basically 2 lanes. And those cars came looking for cigarettes, they came looking for gas. And, for days on end, they would line up on our roads, and it was difficult, to move around them safely. So you start to get a sense of, what is the important economy, and what are people coming in to our community for, from Toronto and Guelph and Kitchener and Niagara Falls and so on. So it's been challenging. And the men of the community, there were about 70 of them that got together and decided that through Nighthawk Security, that they would help to keep our community safe from individuals coming in from the outside, because we would see van loads of people stacked, three to a seat. So there's the driver and the passenger in the front, 2 rows of seats in the back, 3 people in each seat. And, this at a time when social distancing and quarantine is coming to be our daily reality. And yet these people are coming in from outside our community to see if they can buy cigarettes, and that is just horrific on a whole range of levels. And so that's primarily what we've been seeing from the outside. So the men through Nighthawk Security have formed a group to block all roads leading into Six Nations except for residents coming and going. And it's been challenging. There's been some racial slurs and racist incidents occurring at those blockades. But, it is what it is. And people have to understand that this is a global health crisis, and we are smack dab in the middle of it. And whatever Indigenous community you come from, you can be guaranteed of one thing, that you will not have the test kits, you will not have the PPE, you will not have the doctors, the nurses, the hospitals, the ventilators that you need, that's going to be close to you to serve you. That is your guarantee. And then now we come into plan B for the federal government and provincial governments.
And I'm very curious. Sorry, Leah, go ahead.
Yeah, Diane, just before we go with that question, I just wanted to remind the audience that if you have questions for Diane, you can comment right here in YouTube or on Facebook. We'll be collecting your questions and addressing them towards the end. And if you have questions also for Dimitri, please do comment and share those. I was just wondering if, Diane, you could elaborate a little bit. In Canada, we have this kind of rosy understanding of healthcare being a universally available right and a resource. And of course, as you hinted, it's not necessarily so in Indigenous communities. So in this public health crisis, could you comment a little bit about what it's been like to get healthcare at Six Nations?
Well, if you know your history, you would know that Lady Willingdon Hospital was set up at Six Nations from, the 1920s to about the 1960s. And that hospital served the residents of Six Nations. there's a lot of historical research that's being done now on the whole concept of what Indian hospitals really represented in Canada during that time period, because there were sanatoriums for TB. There, Inuit people came, in fact, to Hamilton, Ontario. A large hospital here received them. I don't know if any of those Inuit people ever made it back home again, which is the tragedy. The healthcare that we have primarily in our communities now, depending on your community and how it's organized itself, could be looking towards, in an urban center, an Aboriginal Health Access Center. In communities, there are federally funded health programs through the First Nations Inuit Health Branch of now Indigenous Services Canada. And what we find in our home community of Six Nations is that most of our health programs are provincially funded now. So those are support programs, and through our public health in our community, they do a lot of really great work to support our residents in the community.
So how has it been in terms of getting access to COVID testing kits?
Well, I don't know exactly, and I can't say with any surety what that is all about, but I do know that we have in our community, we have our community center is set up so that you can call, they can do a telephone assessment with you, and if you need to be tested, you can go in for a test. So that's all I know as of today. I don't know what the access is to PPE or to masks or to test kits. You would have to ask actually the director of health, Lori Davis Hill, who would actually have like her finger on the numbers that you're after.
Diane, just one subject I'd like to touch upon while we have you with us is the crisis on the Wet'suwet'en territory. It seems almost an eternity ago that this country was transfixed by the solidarity blockades erupting around the country. This was something that was really sort of thrust into the national consciousness. Mm-hmm. And so much of the news cycle is now dominated. It's almost entirely dominated, and understandably so, by COVID-19. But that national conversation we were having about Indigenous rights and the Wet'suwet'en crisis in particular, and the blockades, has really receded from the foreground. How has this, what is your understanding of what's currently happening in this time of crisis on Wet'suwet'en lands, and how has this affected the ability of Indigenous communities across Canada to continue to show solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en people?
I think our people are primarily concerned about taking care of each other, and especially guarding the elders, who are our wisdom keepers, our ceremonial leaders, and our spiritual leaders. So rightly so, we've turned inward to be able to do that. There will be a time when we can look outwards again and pick up these issues, because these issues never go away. These issues were here from the time of contact, and it will be a continuing issue going forward into the next generations of our young people, because these are land issues. These are essentially land issues. And it has always been about the land. You can talk about rights, you can talk about democracy, you can talk about lofty ideals, but the bottom line is that this will always be about land.
And lastly, Diane, I wanted to ask you about spiritual aspects of this. What spiritual lessons do you draw from this crisis, and do you think we should try to draw from this extraordinary experience in well having?
It makes me think about what Chief Seattle said about whatever you do to the earth, you do to yourself. And, I think about those fires that were burning in northern Alberta, British Columbia, just the edges of the Northwest Territories. I think about those fires raging right across Australia that the absolute degradation of the Amazon by corporations and by a government that is so profoundly weak in its vision for humanity and for the earth, that it would allow, corporations to get in there, start burning the Amazon so that they can get to the resources. They created the burning of the lungs of the earth. They created an inflammation on the earth that will, by burning that biodiversity, that will take generations to restore. What we're experiencing now is, how does Mother Earth react to human beings that continuously defy the natural laws of the earth, defy the universal spiritual laws that are applied to everybody, no matter what faith tradition you come from. There are universal pieces of spiritual law that apply to everybody. They're inescapable. So as human beings, we've defied spiritual law, we've defied natural law, and then we sit here and we wonder, why is it that we are ill now? What is it about our consciousness that needs to be awakened so that we can truly understand that dimension of change that starts with the individual, the family, the community, the nation? There's a fundamental change in consciousness that needs to happen among the human family. And I'm sorry to say that the only time that human beings listen is when everything is taken away from them. And that's what we're experiencing right now. We have been brought to our knees by this microbe, and rightly so, because now is a time for deep reflection about building a new economy, building a new community, building a new health system, building food security system, building a pharmaceutical system, understanding natural healing from the land, respecting traditional healers, respecting environment so that the medicines can grow that traditional healers need. All of those things are now before us. We have an opportunity here to rebuild society in a way that we've never had before. And it's Mother Earth calling us to our attention. Do this now, because if you don't do it now, there's going to be a second wave, a third wave, a fourth wave, and that's what's going to bring down humanity to numbers that were pre-contact.
It's very interesting because you're talking about the change in spiritual consciousness. I read an article 2 days ago in Scientific American, which indicated to me there's a change in the scientific community's understanding about our interactions as human beings with nature. And they talked about the emergence of a new discipline called planetary health. And a lot of the scientists who are leading the development of this discipline are talking about the destruction of biodiversity and natural habitats as being a very important factor in the emergence of these kinds of devastating pandemics. And I'm hopeful, as you are, that we will come out of this with a richer and deeper understanding of our relationship to Mother Earth and of the ways in which we can live in harmony with the planet. That's something that we all desperately need, obviously.
And I just wanted to interject because we have a question from the audience for you, Diane. Mm-hmm. Anne Pohl would like to know, she writes that she believes that you are quite knowledgeable also in traditional medicines. And she was wondering whether your community has been relying on these. In our previous conversation, you were mentioning how in this particular moment, there's like a surge in culture and people are going and collecting medicines and delivering them to the steps of elderly folks in the community. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Thank you. Yes, there's been, I think, a cultural resurgence that's underway in our community as people leave their homes with their children and grandchildren and go into the bush. We live in an area where there's the last stand of Carolinian forest in Canada is in our community, and we're so grateful for that. We're so lucky for that. So we can still go into the bush and find the kinds of medicines that our people are looking for. And we also have really active traditional healers in our community. There's a place called the Blue House, and then there's another place called Judah's Place, which was primary care medicine and traditional medicine combined, and it's it's evolving into more traditional medicine now. So teaching about what those medicines are, where to find them, when to pick them, how to pick them, all the spiritual and cultural protocols that go with picking medicine. So yes, you know, the people have really been relying on that, and most of all relying on their faith in the Creator and faith in our ceremonies, that our ceremonies will carry us through this time period, that, you know, the ceremonies pray for our people and the well-being of our people, but the ceremonies ultimately pray for everyone, you know, that we're going to listen to the change that is upon us and act on that change. And it's not just enough to say, you know, there's a rise in spiritual consciousness or there's a rise in environmental consciousness, but it's much more than that. It is also the pieces that have to be put into action to bring that change about. And, you know, I just want to say a few words about young people, because young people, according to our prophecies, are born with gifts. In this generation, everybody 30 and under, born with gifts that are so needed at this time of the change in Mother Earth and the change that is upon us now. And with that change, these young people are able to put together their spiritual gifts as well as their education and their life experience to build a new society for us. I really believe in those young people who are spiritually grounded and bringing that change forward.
What a beautiful, beautiful note to end on. If you have any more questions for Diane Longboat, please post on Dimitri Lascaris' page and we will send those along. Thank you so much, Diane, for joining us. It's been very lovely to speak to you.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been a great program. Enjoyed every minute.
Take care. Be safe and healthy, Diane.
Thank you, and you too.
Bezrat Hashem. And I don't know if you know Dimitri, but we're entering Passover tomorrow in the Jewish community. This will be a very, very different Passover than any Passover that I've ever experienced, in terms of everybody basically planning their community get-togethers virtually to celebrate the time when we were liberated out of slavery. So it's going to be a very interesting time. I just wanted to remind the audience, if you have questions, comment here in YouTube. You can go to Dimitri Lascaris' page on Facebook. That's facebook.com/vote.dimitri. You can post some questions there, and we do have a couple more questions from the audience that audience members were hoping we would tackle. But before I get to those, Dimitri, what was it like for you, what Diane was saying?
I was very moved. I mean, there was so much in it that I think is instructive for all of us who come from the non-Indigenous community, but I was very moved by what Diane had to say at the end, as you were. The idea that the youth, you know, they have a gift, and I think if I could add anything to that observation, is that our responsibility as the older generation is to enable them to discover what their gift is and to realize their gift and to make the most use of it for the greater good. And I think I have to say, you know, honestly and self-critically, that my generation has not done a particularly good job of doing that. And I think my role and those of my generation now, our overarching responsibility is to enable the young people of this world to realize their potential and give them the tools that they need to overcome the climate emergency, the, you know, pandemics, whatever crisis may confront us at this time.
Well, you're kind of a gym buff, so I'm not actually sure what generation you belong to. Are we in the same generation, or?
Well,
because I don't think my generation has done a very good job of that either.
At my age, Leah, you're much younger than me. One has to do whatever it takes to prevent the deterioration of the body. So
thank God for that. Yeah. So I was really kind of moved by the things that Dan was saying. And I'm really glad that the community is coming together. I think when we were brainstorming this show, we were kind of thinking about so many things that remain as big questions. You mentioned Wet'suwet'en in that interview with Diane, and it's hard to wrap our minds around it. But Wet'suwet'en solidarity and the land blockade, that was 24 hours primetime news a month ago. Mm-hmm. I know it feels like it was centuries ago, but that was a month ago. And a month ago, the Canadian public was largely saying, we can't shut down the rails from Ottawa to Toronto. That's crazy. That's so disruptive. And then, 1 month later, the entire country and the whole world is shut down in some ways.
And how the governments reacted to this much bigger disruption to our economy. All of a sudden,
100%.
Hundreds of billions of dollars have materialized out of thin air in order, quite rightly, of course, in order to protect Canadians who are being devastated by the economic crisis occasioned by COVID-19. And yet we made it sound, or not we, but the leaders of this country made it sound as though the much smaller economic disruption caused by those solidarity blockades was something that could only be dealt with by imposing what they call the rule of law, and in some cases even brute force, rather than
and was only necessary because of the tone deaf response, right? Nobody wants to put their life on hold to go and blockade and take on risk and stand in the face of violence and have to do all the things that they had to do. Absolutely. Yeah. But in terms of government's response, this brings me to an audience question. This one is about the stringent but necessary measures, and the question is from Jesse McCallum. Again, if you guys have questions, please just comment here in the YouTube or on Dimitri Lascaris' page, facebook.com/vote.dimitri. So Jesse's question is, are all parties in lockstep that an all or nothing approach resembling China is what's best suits Canadians? I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I think every country, if you look across the globe, every country is adapting to this crisis in ways that are unique to the circumstances confronting that country. So, for example, I understand that in Norway, where there's been a much less threatening infiltration of this virus into Norwegian society, they are now talking about reopening the economy. Austria is making moves in that direction as well. And I think that this has something to do with both luck, because to some extent or another, it is a matter of luck which societies are getting most affected by this. But it's also a question of the quality of the healthcare system. It's a question of, to the extent to which we have vulnerable peoples in our society, homeless, poor, people who are in poor health. So every society has to adapt to the particular circumstances confronting that society. I think we do have to be mindful about the fact that an economic crisis is going to have negative health impacts. Right. But I think it's a false choice to say we have to choose between protecting health and protecting the economy. If the government steps up and uses its massive resources, which are far in excess of those of the corporate community, to protect Canadians, especially the most vulnerable Canadians, then we won't be forced to make that choice between economic well-being or economic stability and health. We can have both, but it's really going to depend on all levels of government, and particularly the federal government, to step in and protect people.
And there's so many people, all around me and all around this country who are forced to make that choice. And of course, that risk is incredibly magnified when we look at folks who are struggling with homelessness, people who have no status in this country. The overlap of the opioid epidemic and the COVID pandemic has been devastating. In the last 4 years, 14,000 Canadians died because of the opioid epidemic, which is, almost 100 people a day. So this is part of a complex public health crisis. But I see now that we have another question live, and those questions we won't get a chance to get to today. We are going to collect them all, and every week at Tuesday at 5:30, we'll be going live with a different guest and trying to tackle some of those questions. So please do continue to send your questions either through the chat on YouTube to Dimitri directly or on his page. And we have Stephanie Kelly who's asking whether under the leadership of Dimitri Lascaris, were he to win the leadership of the Green Party, which we all assume he will, whether the Green Party will support offers of international solidarity, such as Cuban doctors who try to travel to Manitoba.
Yeah, so if it's a Stephanie Kelly that I know personally, hello, Stephanie. Great to hear from you. Thank you for watching our program today. Stephanie is a great, activist and proponent of social justice in our country. So Stephanie, I think you're probably referring to this controversy that just erupted. Indigenous peoples or an Indigenous community in Manitoba asked to be allowed to receive Cuban doctors in order to help them cope with this crisis. Of course, I support that entirely. If there are Indigenous peoples in this country, anywhere in the country, who want to receive outside assistance from capable, qualified medical professionals, they should be allowed to have that. The history of our treatment of Indigenous peoples really leaves very little confidence that ultimately, it's sad to say, that the federal government will protect them in this moment of crisis. And they have every reason to be concerned about whether they're going to receive adequate aid in order to deal with it. If they want to receive help from the outside world, I encourage that. I think the government should get out of the way and allow them to have it. And I think ultimately that should be the decision of each Indigenous community around the country, if that's something they want. And if they want, we shouldn't get in the way of it.
Great. That is a great note to end on. I will also mention one very, very interesting question from a David Kattenberg, also live. And I think that this question is such a huge question that we will break it up and answer it piece by piece in the weeks to come. And that question is this an opportunity to transition the global economy away from carbon and to make it more sustainable and human-oriented? Excellent question, David Kattenberg. And just before we finish the show, do you have a few words to close us out, Dimitri? And what do you recommend that we do in this moment?
Just to briefly respond to David Kattenberg, I know him personally as well, Dr. Kattenberg. He's actually somebody I'm representing in a pro bono proceeding involving a human rights matter. I'm honored to know him. Absolutely, this is such a moment. And I think, in fact, all of this economic aid that we're seeing, requests that we're seeing from large corporations around the country at this dire moment in our economic history, this is an opportunity for us actually to ensure that they reform themselves. We should be conditioning aid to industries that historically have contributed to the climate emergency, and particularly on reforms that are going to get us to where we need to be in terms of having a sustainable economy and a healthy planet. I don't see much indication that that's happening thus far, but I'm hopeful that we will take, that could be the great silver lining in this extraordinary crisis. We need to have political leadership that is willing to condition aid on indispensable reforms. So in terms of what we're going to do next week, Leah, you talked about the opioid crisis. We're going to have a guest very, very well known to Canadians, widely admired, in particular with his work in terms of addiction and the opioid crisis, amongst other matters of addiction. I'm really excited to have him on. We'll be announcing who our guest is going to be in the days ahead. And I hope you'll join us for our next episode. We want to keep this conversation going right up until the time that we can get back to conventional forms of campaigning, and maybe even beyond that. So thanks very much for joining.
And I'd also love to tackle in one of these episodes, we cannot have sustainable change without our political leaders. So as someone who is running to become a political leader, how is this campaign unfolding for you? There's so many questions to ask and to answer. So thank you very much, Dimitri, and of course to Diane Longboat for joining us in this show. Please join us again next Tuesday at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And don't forget to drop us your questions, suggestions for guests, or anything else that you think Dimitri should tackle in these Dimitri live shows.
Thank you, Leah. Pleasure.